Excellent. And guys, the best way to view this, if you go to the right corner, there's view, you can go to speaker view. And that way, whoever's talking, it will go to them automatically. You can also pin the person if you go onto their screen and just pin them so they're playing at the same time. So without further ado, guys, welcome to ECC Adventures summer edition of, it's a speaker series. It's called Explore Arabia. We've had some wonderful guests so far. The first one was Linda from ADCRC, the Arabian Desert Riding Center organization. And she talked about their establishing the first sort of camel training center that allows for expats to kind of come in. And then the second one we had Tharundu, TK. He is an ecologist that works with Shuruk, and he's worked with Wadareya National Park. He's also done stuff with the National Aquarium that's opening up in Abu Dhabi. So our third speaker is Dr. Michael Cowen. He's a very interesting person. I actually met him a while ago when I first came here I was working in Elaine, and we actually met on this group. It was called, why did it slip me? Elaine Weekends. So Elaine Weekends was a sort of a recreational group that would do hikes in Bahraini, in Oman, as well as in Musandam and the Elaine sort of area. So it was really interesting getting to know him. And here we are, he's done some amazing work. He was just starting out back then. He was like, trying to work out some of the photography, and he's done some amazing work ever since. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Michael. Dr. Michael, how are you doing? Oh, sorry. Dr. Cohen, you're muted right now.
There we go. No. Thanks for that lovely introduction. Thanks for inviting me to chat. I'm going to share my presentation screen, so I just want to check that people can see that okay?
Yep, I can see.
And I'm going to minimize myself from the window, because there's one thing I hate doing is talking to like my own image looking back at me. I find that rather odd, right? Okay, so again, thank you for the opportunity to share some ideas about photography and philosophy. Actually, what you're seeing is the sort of early work that I'm thinking about with regards to a second book. I did a first book a couple of years ago, and for various reasons, I wasn't quite satisfied with it, which, is a good thing. It sort of pushed me to do something, beyond what I had attempted before. But, I probably in hindsight shouldn't have put philosophy in the title. I need to learn from Baudrillard in the art of marketing and seduction, because I think putting philosophy in the title probably had the opposite effect of bringing people to the table. But anyway, aside from that. But why philosophy? I've heard so many times in recent years how meaningless philosophy is in our lives. And, some from disciplines such as neuroscience would believe that all the answers will be, by studying the brain, and we will have no need of philosophy. But, if we take problems in the world today, such as climate change, Palestine, Israel, equity, justice, global pandemics, the social media algorithms, all this kind of stuff, I think philosophy is the one space that has proven itself over 2,500 years to, invent concepts and reinvent concepts that help us at least articulate and perhaps even address, in some cases, problems. If anything, sort of transcendent old texts that have been around for a very long time are sometimes at the causes of the problems we face today, or they're just not really in a position to tackle something like, social media's algorithm. Now, I did my PhD over a period of about 6 years as a hobby. It's a strange thing, right, to do as a hobby. You do photography as a hobby, not philosophy. But I studied the concepts of Michel Foucault and got sort of involved with some of the French continental philosophy group. So that's kind of the background for why I think philosophy is important. Now, in terms of the photograph, it's another passion of mine. You know, I've had a camera since the 80s, off and on, more off probably than on, but in the last 5 years, I've certainly done, a lot with the camera, as Chris pointed out. But I wonder how many of us suffer from a kind of image fatigue, fatigue of the cliche. The massification and miniaturization of the camera has led to something like they estimate 1.4 trillion images that will be taken this year. Surprisingly, that's not many per person. It's only 183, I calculated it. But it seems, everything is fair game, and photography has become a voracious way of seeing. Now, myself I don't consider myself particularly as a landscape photographer, but more that I've done landscape photography here in the UAE is a kind of safe thing to do, right? I also like street. I also like portraits. I, have done other things over the time, over the years. But the landscape photographer in particular, one who's actually in our call today, Renee from Switzerland, would understand the sort of notion that the landscape photographer is perhaps entering a period of existential crisis. The mere volume of landscape images is almost, sends everyone spiraling into some sort of zone, some sort of identity work as such to sort of justify where they sit in the world. But I've also been particularly interested in listening to photographers. There are loads of photographers, famous ones, YouTube, all this kind of stuff. And they have, all of these quite mystified narratives behind, what they want to do in a photograph. Like, I want to share the experience with you. I want people to connect with nature. I want them to see something that they wouldn't have seen if they were standing there, but, because I'm so great, I'll show you, all this kind of stuff. So, that's where I've sort of started for me, this cross line between, or trajectory of philosophy on one hand and photography on the other. Okay. So let's get into some images. The rest will just be images with me talking. Okay. So perhaps you guys as hikers are photographers as well. I'd like to, perhaps in the question and answers, we could discuss this. And there are some similarities. I've been a hiker photographer before, where hiking is the main thing we do. And the camera that we take and the photos we take are just to take a memory, take a record of the event. On the other hand, I'm more these days a photographer hiker. So, sorry, the other way around. A photographer hiker. So the end is the photograph, and I will hike. I will put some work in to get that light, that location, that image, and so forth. Okay. But this sort of realist, objective view of reality, what you're seeing here with the landscape, the desert and the trees, this is pretty close to as realist kind of a photograph as I'm a witness. I take an image and share it with you. This has been around for a long time in photography and in art, also the sort of notion of realism. But while the photograph can be a spectre, an objective representation, a copy, it is always at the same time, for me at least, fairly subjective. And we know a photograph can lie. There's been numerous cases over the decades, right, of scandals around something that people trusted to be true, but didn't end up being true, and so forth. But even in these two images here, I've added a graduated filter on the picture of the desert with the trees, and I've perhaps done some dodging and burning, and so even though it is a realist sort of capture of what I roughly saw, I did enhance it, right? Interestingly enough, the tree on the right-hand side has now fallen down. I went back to this site, I do that occasionally. And so it's also quite obvious how the photograph in the realist sense, in the witness sense, is capturing a moment in time. Now, in these two images here, you know, of camels, I was quite surprised when I came across them one day a couple of years ago, of camels grazing. I'd always seen this sort of cliche image of some Bedouin towing the, you know, the train of camels into the sunset, you know. and we all get used to this cliche, right? But this is an example here where the fact that they're grazing and eating, which doesn't even really seem to be much food there for them to eat, but they are. But on the left-hand side is more realist and objective. And on the second-hand side, you can see again, I've cloned out the camel poo. I've perhaps changed with the tonality somewhat. I've added a gradient. So, you know, it's, I just want to sort of blur this line between our sort of assumption of the photograph as real versus the photograph as subjective. Now, for, you know, almost all the images that I take, you will not find a person in it. I'm not attached to the compositional idea that says you need to add a person to show scale in an image, nor the idea from very famous photographers who say, look, it's our responsibility to show this sort of humanity in the moment and so forth, like Robert Frank. If anything, I would side on the others, like Sebastião Salgado, who would actually say, no, I think we need to show the inhumanity of the moment. You'll see in a couple of slides how I did a couple of images of plastics in the desert. But I not only remove man from my images, I mean man as in man and woman. I not only remove man, but I gradually have removed objects also. It's almost as if I was off on some sort of quest for, you know, the aesthetic form of the dune, some sort of pure Juneness, so to speak. But that said, you know, even in these two images here with the camels on the left-hand side and the abstract shot of looking down on a desert area, you've got the straps which are sitting on the camel. So you've still got man in this image. And of course, you've got all the dune bashes vehicle tracks in the second image. So occasionally it slips in there, but as a rule, I try to, you know, strip man out. And these two images here, they're quite different from the rest, but I just wanted to point out that I do occasionally sort of, you know, break these things. And I did a couple of short series on plastics in the environment, and I was quite taken by the fact that the desert or nature has in some sense trying to attempt to decompose the plastics right in front of my very eyes here. As the sort of these salt sauchas have kind of wrapped themselves around the plastic, and the sun and the wind and so forth trying to break it down. However, in this world of plastics, you know, all that we actually end up with is smaller pieces of plastic, and it never actually decomposes, not in using our current technology. So my point here is that, you know, I talked about photography as the documenter. I'm also now talking about the sort of photographer sort of as subjective and expressionist and so forth. But also here, the photograph and the photographer is political, as an ideological weapon. And again, I'm not saying really anything particularly new. I'm just sort of positioning my work here within the history of photography. And these two shots, you know, clearly man's legacy is visible, but yet they say quite different things. On one hand, we've got on the left-hand side a dune that's, you know, completely covered some fence area in Al Razin. And I frankly think it's quite a beautiful image in its own right, but it does sort of, it is an ideological kind of image about desertification. And on the right-hand side, even more kind of dark and dystopian can be certainly interpreted. The sort of the desert reclaiming the earth, you know, and reclaiming itself from a road that had been built, and due to its unuse by man, it's being taken back, you know. And that sort of image is also quite powerful because, you know, in a way, if we don't address the issues of climate change, and by the way, I work for the Environment Agency, you know, the fact that man will no longer exist will make no difference to the planet whatsoever. You know, it will continue on without us. But anyway, the point is that sometimes the image can be repositioned into the role of politician, as influencer, as a thought provoker. I think that's important. However, as long as the argument about the photograph and photography as documenter, as a witness, there's been the counter to this, which is says, no, you know, it's fine art. It's we are photographer artists, okay? And this is, I think, for me, part of the Descartesian hangover of mind and body and object and subject, this sort of dualist thinking in Western philosophy in particular. And it continues to this day. I mean, it absolutely plagues, I think, the photography circles. And also part of the reason why I'm exploring, is there another way of looking at the photograph? Okay. Here are a couple of images where, you know, like take John Berger, for example. He thought that landscape photography is much like fashion photography, where essentially, like this image on the left, you've got a moody model that's posing for our pleasure, right? But even the sort of photographs span the witness account as much as the expressive account. You know, the one on the left is actually, other than the fact that it's cropped and I've removed the color, that is a realist interpretation of the scene. On the right-hand side, however, there's quite a different image, because it's severely cropped. I didn't see the image as I presented it here. It was done, you know, in post-processing. I cropped right in once I noticed the layers, and to me looked like, in fact, figurative art, where sort of bodies are laying down beside each other. Now, the post-structural philosophers, which we'll come to shortly, this sort of expressive notion of the, you know, stuff coming from the inside, is very much, we should be suspicious of. You know, this existential phenomenological way of looking at the photograph is a little bit romantic from post-structural philosophers' point of view. Now, finally, we've covered here, this has just covered the first section, and if there are any questions at this point before we go to post-structural, then I'll be happy to answer any. But these two first sections are really to try and highlight that in the history of photography, we've had this photograph as objective, photograph as subjective, and this photographer as documenter, or a witness versus artist. And I think Susan Sontag really says it right when she says, you know, the photograph is a paradigm that's inherently equivocal connection between ourselves and the world. You know, we've been plagued by this old debate. And while I've been happy to surf in between these particular ideas, in recent years, and particularly in the last few months, I really felt the need to sort of seek more inspiration. So I'll stop just here for a couple of minutes. If anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to answer at this point, or we can carry on. Up to you.
I might have a question or two, and if anyone wants to, they can pop some in the chat or just raise their hand. Okay. But so something is really interesting as you're talking about your journey towards interpreting philosophical concepts with your photography. A lot of times we see the notion of art imitating life, or life imitating art. When it comes to your photography, do you feel that it naturally goes towards the post-structuralists or the existentialists, or whichever body of philosophy? Or do you feel that you take the shot and then sort of do this minimalist manufacturing that goes towards that, and as well as the art that you decide to provide?
Okay, great question. Well, for a post-structural philosopher, you know, we need to be very suspicious of our own motives. In fact, do we even understand our own motives and rationality and so forth? For them, which sort of helps lead on to the next section anyway, is this sort of notion that, you know, it's not a point of view or a perspective that I have. It's actually, I am revealed by the perspective that defines me. You know, William James was the pragmatist and said, you know, the world is relative and we all have our own different perspectives, but, you know, the post-structuralists flip this on its head and say, no, no. So what I would argue, but if we were to be consistent with this view, is that photographers are actually have less agency than they think. And but even painters, even artists, you know, before the invention of photography, there was no such thing as a blank slate, blank page, right? They understood the history of painting and sculpture and so forth. They understood what they had seen, and many of them copied and paid homage and so forth. So I think if I have answered your question at all, I'm not sure. Excuse me if I haven't, but I think it's less about what comes in the inside out and more about where we are in the trajectory of life and what we're bouncing in between and who with and what we're looking at and so forth, what we're reading. This produces images. And we almost, as Deleuze would say, we're basically surfing a wave, you know?
Mm-hmm. So you are sort of a product of something, and then you're internally looking at why am I the product? Why am I producing this art? If I have that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like consciousness is not much more, let's say, and I haven't studied consciousness, so please don't take me there. But the next level would be, you know, consciousness is really something like a light that just is shining itself on the world and so forth and reacting and whatever. But it's not that particularly rational, and it's, I think, shaped very much by the apparatuses around them. Okay, but let's move on. So what I wanted to point out first was yeah, I told you I did a PhD and it was with Michel Foucault. They were inspired by Friedrich Nietzsche, and everybody knows Nietzsche. I mean, Nietzsche killed God, right? He didn't actually kill God ontologically. I mean, he killed it epistemologically, right? That man created God and so forth. Now, other post-structural photographers, you know, he wasn't a post-structuralist. He was even a pre-existentialist. But people like Roland Barthes, Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, Baudrillard, they all have done these similar sort of Nietzschean reversals. And Barthes killed the author and therefore killed the photographer. And also killed the spectator, which basically means he killed you as a viewer of photography. Derrida killed language, Foucault killed man, Baudrillard killed reality and the fact that we're all living in a simulation, in a hyper-real world and so forth. So you can see a post-structural philosopher, why they get a bad rap, you know, in terms of what these guys are doing. But in actual fact, their work is incredibly inspiring and incredibly liberating to try and show that, you know, history, language and these things are malleable, permeable, and that actually we can live in a counter way to what we perhaps lived in the past. And they've all shown that in their very different ways. Apologies for being so reductionist. I mean, I studied Foucault for 6 years, so I would be more comfortable talking to him, but I've also studied Deleuze now for a number of months and starting to feel a little bit more comfortable with him. Okay, but at the end of the day, these philosophers would say that man is but an instrument and a vehicle of power, albeit from different abstract machines. In other words, you know, is it capitalism? Is it discipline for Foucault? Is it governmentality for Foucault? And is it seduction and marketing and so forth? I'm just a dig for Rene. For Baudrillard, you know, this is their view. Okay, now, but not all these photographers are murderers. You know, it's not all actually about death. And I found with studying Deleuze that Deleuze in fact turned to art for inspiration on developing new concepts in philosophy. So I thought that was wonderful, and he has a philosophy that's much. It's an ontology for a start. It's not just solely about epistemology. He's really taking a full view here. He's a heavy hitter. But what he settled on in the end is that ultimately we're all creating, desiring machines. We desire to create. And that really was the start of this. And I hoped that when I took this investigation into post-structural philosophers, that I would find, you know, something positive, you know, about photography. I found the exact opposite. Oh my God. They absolutely, all of them, including Deleuze, are absolutely scathing about photography. And that, you know, photography is caught up in representation, in imitation, in copies. It's caught up in, you know, there's no author. There's, you know, it's art really got a lot of positive, you know, feedback from them, but photography, absolutely not. So I was kind of gutted when I came across this, you know, that I was now going to have to do some work in order to sort of take some inspiration from them. So let's tackle two of their criticisms quickly. The first is about the copy, the imitation, the, you know, and we see it. I mean, if you look on Instagram, you know, the photographer is copying another photographer, is copying another one. There's even an account called Insta Repeat, which has picked up on this and shows how much copying there is. You know, so whether it's the Northern Lights or whether it's, you know, a shot, whatever it is on Instagram, you know, people are just copying after copy after copy, okay? And I think this does lead a lot of people to this image fatigue that I mentioned. But me as a photographer, I've also passed through this. I've gone to New Zealand, to Iceland, to Greenland to chase these epic scenes, to chase the epic light and so forth. And I have also imitated, but, you know, artists also did that. And I think perhaps the post-structuralists are being a little bit rough on photographers that in terms of the sort of dirtiness and cheapness of copying and imitating. Yeah, that's all I wanted to say on there. Okay, let's tackle the second criticism, which is about sort of fixed representation of the world. Well, their target is from Aristotle forward. You know, most of the philosophers have attempted to say, you know, this is essentially this or essentially this. This is the laws of the universe. This is the laws of physics. And science has been very much dependent on this security, right? I understand that. But like Deleuze thinks that there's more to language than the words. You know, when you read something, whether it be poetry or you hear something or whatever, there is something behind sometimes language that can provoke thought and feeling, emotion, and so forth. And so I naturally, intuitively believe that there's more to the image than might be in the image, something beyond the event horizon. I think it might be easier to show with multiple photographs, and perhaps partly that's what I'm doing here. Roland Barthes, even though he came from a phenomenological point of view, he referred to the madness of a photograph as something that was, you know, beyond, often found in the details. And I don't know about you guys, but he called this punctum. He had a special name for it. And I think these types of photographs actually are quite rare. I have seen one. I pulled out a photograph from a box of old photographs I took in the 80s. And when I looked at it, I mean, it almost knocked me flat. It was a picture of my grandmother, but it wasn't my grandmother that knocked me flat. It was the small details in the shot about the stereo in the 80s, the chair that was in the back of the room, the wallpaper. You know, it just brought back so many memories that it pinched me. In fact, it probably punched me, if not decked me. So that's what Roland Barthes is talking about. Now, Deleuze in the post-structural tradition talked about the hysteria of Francis Bacon's paintings. If you've ever seen them, some of the most gruesome paintings ever done. So, you know, I kind of, is there something here in this notion of madness and hysteria? Perhaps there's something, you know. Now, I think the fixing of the photograph's place in the world by post-structural philosophers itself is an extraordinarily startling error. I mean, really. I mean, I want to argue that instead of looking at the photograph as somehow some cheap copy to fix identity, that the photographer was always and necessarily operating from a positionality. This is both, you can see in these two images here. One is a very close macro shot of a very small dune, and the other one, no, it's not even a dune, it's a crease on the desert floor. And the second image to the right is actually an aerial shot with a drone. And therefore, you know, these sorts of different positions, the camera was taken in different positions, but also the positionality of space and time. You know, it's an inventory of sorts. You know, even though there's going to be 1.4 trillion images, it is always partial, and it is just a fragment, a fractal slice of space and time. So I just don't buy this argument that it is some sort of a cheap copy. I have to reject this argument. Now, I've removed the context in both of these images, and I've you know, inserted some sort of violence in the sense that I've only put in the picture in these four corners. But it's always going to be partial. It's always going to be fractal. So I want to point out this sort of notion of you know, the photograph as an event in space and time, and it's not about fixing identity. Now, these two images, the positionality is quite extreme. You know, one is hundreds of meters in the air, and the other one again is looking down at just the color of the red sand in Liwa, you know, and in Tal Marib, where I noticed, you know, people probably see different things in this, but I saw what I thought was the, you know, the tree of life, just in this tiny, small area, which I pointed the camera down and took a shot. A friend of mine said, no, he thought it was an orange peel, you know. But anyway, my point is positionality, you know, can be quite extreme. And I think it's important aspect that post-structural philosophers did not really give much attention to. I created a word, so just for fun, you know, they have photographer as witness or documenter as one end, and then you had the photographer as artist as another. I created the word inventorialist because in my mind, what I do as a photographer is at the same time a person who makes an inventory. I take a shot in time and space, but it also I invent, you know, and that sort of, I want to collapse the subject object into one. For me, this debate about one or the other is, you know, has been going on for so long, it's just tired, it doesn't get us anywhere. Now, I don't want to reduce this inventorialist notion to the hegemony of purposes or telos, because I think we're also imprisoned by this. A lot of people say, look, if you're this kind of photographer, then if that's the purpose of your photography, then this is what, you know, you are and what you do. No, we need to be able to, in the post-structural spirit of things, try and release ourselves from these prisons, you know. So I'm now getting to the last few slides now of my presentation. But I've spent comparatively to most quite a lot of time in the desert, and yet I admit I don't know her very well. The desert is a void that remains seldom influenced by molar lines, life does not exist in the life does exist in the desert at the molecular. And I photographed the desert from many different perspectives in order to discover her secrets. But she hasn't talked to me yet. It's almost, in fact, the fact that I have a camera in my hands, she has remained silent. She refuses to speak to me. She refuses to reveal herself until I'm such a time I'm prepared to give her the respect of leaving my camera behind. It's almost as if she's in pain every time I pull the trigger and capture a part of her essence that is destined for the open market. Or perhaps similar to Aboriginal dreamings, the desert is somehow a forbidden knowledge. The camera, now ubiquitous in our lives, becomes this intermediary, or better said, obstacle to enjoying and experiencing the desert in itself. And, or perhaps more simply, there are just no dryads in the desert. And one is only destined to find the echoes of oneself. So over time, I've come to see the desert quite differently. In particular, in my first book, I used the term nature's signatures. And I like this idea of the wind and the climate and the conditions to shape the dunes and change them and effectively cast their signature across, using the desert as their canvas. So despite the claims of post-structural philosophy, the photograph, in my view, will not fix or fasten the nature of the desert or the desert in nature. The desert is a becoming, not a being, and it changes every day, every minute, perhaps every second. And a photograph or a sequence of photographs can only situate her in her temporal nature of her reality. So in these last couple of images, what I want to show is that I've become, increasingly minimal, increasingly attempting to do as Picasso did with his bull, of removing more and more and more from the image in order to somehow reveal the truth behind her reality. So on the left-hand side is certainly more of an aesthetic image. And the one on the left is a more traditional image, but on the right. But if you notice closely, the wind is blowing, the light is piercing through a sandstorm. The right-hand image does certainly capture this notion of difference rather than sameness, right? But that said, I've come to an abrupt conclusion that while the photograph may not produce concepts like philosophy in their own right, they do have a part to play in the say, capacity to be integral to the development of concepts. And in my view, my most simplest images are the ones that provoke the most thought. And while I've been on this quest for something essential Juneness, a search for beauty, quiet, and pure form of difference, the desert is in some ways a void, an emptiness that has not talked to me directly, but has instead revealed to me a space for thinking and thought. So these last two slides are some of the works I'm most proud of, and they are quite recent. And they're not meant to fix the representation of what a dune is or what a dune isn't. But I think I do attempt through these images to create a calm space for thought. Now, just to wrap up, I began the talk with the object-subject and the binary thinking of much of the history of philosophy, but also photography. And I showed that I surfed through both. But then I moved into post-structural philosophy and found that their criticisms of photography were crushing. That said, I continued forward and have sort of, worked with their concepts and worked with my experience. And I believe through this notion of seeing the photograph as an event, see the photographer as becoming something, becoming therapist, becoming explorer, becoming activist, becoming whatever, these are neither fixed identities for the photographer. And in spite of the doom and gloom of the post-structural philosophers, found this notions of desiring machines, rhizomatic ontological thinking, and many other concepts, a whole bunch of, productive concepts to help me work out through this cognitive dissonance. And on the last slide, I want to wish, to end this with this triptych. This sits on my wall in my lounge. It's a piece of inventory. It's an invention that I'm proud of. And it's equivalent, as I said before, of Picasso's Bulls, where, I feel through removing color, imposing a monotone, to removing the objects of distraction, I have got quite close to the essence of difference, of Juneness. So while post-structural philosophy was a provocation, I did find comfort in this notion of myself as an inventorialist and not succumbing to telos and purposes. And I do believe that bringing the discussion of philosophy to photography is itself, not only for me, a productive endeavor, but something that as we sort of widen it into the community of photographers, that we can sort of, I don't mean to say, I want the photograph to remain central to solving problems of the world. And I don't mean the ubiquitous photograph that drives us to image fatigue, but I mean to the photograph that makes us, or allows us, in the case of my images, I hope, to think. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening. It went on longer than I thought.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing. If you guys have questions, please feel free to unmute your mic or to share in the chat. But I did have one question that was from a while ago from Mr. Renee, I believe. I don't know if you want to look in the chat or I can read it out loud.
I just have to, how do I get this whole thing back?
Yeah, so at the bottom,
I minimized it somehow.
Okay. If you want to, you can, I'll stop share or screen share.
Okay. Yeah, could you do that?
Yeah, 1 second.
Oh, there we go. I can see everyone again. Fantastic.
Yeah,
thank you.
Yeah, so his question was, you spoke about fine art in the beginning against the backdrop of the I'm going to butcher this, Wittgensteinianism. It is impossible to find art or fine art. However, we all want to create something intentional with impact. How can we create without knowing how to?
Well, Renee, I'm not sure I covered that in my talk. To be fair, you're saying how can we create without knowing how to create? And you're essentially saying that we all have to some sense go through the apprenticeship of creating or crafting something with the mediums we use. I don't know. Sorry, I don't have an answer to that question. I can tell you that my 3-year-old son, he's quite creative, and he's never gone on any Coursera YouTube video to watch how to paint or whatever. And one of his nicest pieces of art is with just taking his cars and dipping them in paint and driving over the paper, So I wonder whether or not this sort of, again, this delusion notion that there is a part of all of us that has this desire to create, and it's not something that has to be learned. Yeah, I'm not sure we have to learn it. I think if you grab a piece of paper and a paintbrush, or you grab a camera, or you grab a pencil, or whatever the medium is, just go, right? Just go.
I actually have a question as well. So what is it that like sparks the light in you when that prompts you to take a photograph? or like when you're going on an adventure, like what is it that like what is your main intention behind behind capturing a photograph? Is it like the aesthetics, or is it like maybe like a concept that you're trying to like relate, or is it just like, so where'd you get that drive from exactly? Or how would you describe it?
Well, again, the existentialists would tell us that it comes from the inside, right? Look deep inside yourself, and like the photographer I mentioned before that said, our photographs are actually inner landscapes. They're not out there. What is you're showing? It's revealing your insides, your inner states.
Mm,
But Deleuze has the opposite. He says, no, things come from the outside. There's nothing really on the inside. And therefore the motive for doing something or not doing something can come from the outside. I mean, a good example of this might be recently I've had a negative reaction to Instagram's algorithm.
mm,
And what I noticed with the algorithm is that it was from the outside was starting to push me in a certain direction, and to produce new content on a frequent basis and to get it up there. And the ones that didn't have enough likes, it was sort of poking me and pushing me to say, well, obviously that's not working. You need to be
to
doing
create a
something
certain
else.
kind,
So, yeah.
yeah.
So I think if I haven't quite got to the question of motive yet, but there is this sort of awareness, if we call it consciousness, of how
Right.
we are shaped and how we are imprisoned and how we're, and I'm motivated, if you like, by the post-structural project, which is we should be trying to run our lives with just a little bit less governance than we currently have, and so but out in the landscape, this is a little bit different when you were talking about chasing the light, for example, because last year before the coronavirus, I was in Lofoten, and the weather changed like so fast, and the light the tripod was almost useless. I mean, the light was so fleeting that you were just chasing her almost like a dance, so I think that turns a little bit instinctual with experience, and that shot I showed you of the desert with the sand flying everywhere. I knew when I was standing in that was an unusual circumstance,
Mm.
and therefore
You
go.
yeah, right, like you felt the need to like capture it. You felt the need that there was
Yeah,
a reason for you to capture it, because it was something
yeah,
that you it just like the image just came to you and you felt like it
yeah.
needed to be captured.
It's almost like the desert was telling me, you need to get your camera out and take this
So,
shot, because and you're gonna have to do it quick.
yeah, exactly, yeah. So when did you say like it's like does it wouldn't you say that the drive comes from like capturing the beauty in itself, or perhaps like I don't know, like trying to like relate the image that you see to a concept that you that you fancy or something?
Yeah, I mean,
Or
we as artists and as photographers, we have a lot of images already in our mind. We've seen, I don't know how many millions of images that we've all seen, from
mm,
marketing through movies, on Instagram, and so perhaps there's sort of almost Deleuze has called us collage makers. We actually see multiple things, and then if we see a combination of them, we're driven to push it. But I think landscape photographers in particular are perhaps creatures of habit, and they know that the sunrise light, the sunset light, they position themselves to try and get the optimal conditions and so forth. So it's like when you go swimming or drive a car, you don't really think about it anymore, right? When you're changing gear or what you're using the brakes, you just drive. And I think for photographers, once they've held a camera in their hands for a number of years, you're just driving,
mm.
But yeah, I think
Yep.
it's a good question about motive, and it's one that we should be highly suspicious of. our
Yeah,
motives.
yeah. I feel like, yeah. So sorry to like keep this going, but like I feel like it is like more of a like a natural calling or something. Like no, I wouldn't like to put it that way, but like it's something that because like you say that, you know, like it's a habitual thing, but I'm not too sure if it is, to be honest. Like in my case, I like sometimes I wouldn't get the urge to go out on a beautiful day, which I think I would capture like pretty nice shots. Um, but on other days, like I just have that urge. It just comes like, you know, naturally. But like um, I don't think it really matters on about, you know, getting that perfect moment or getting that perfect sunrise capture or something like that. I think it just like I feel like you can actually like even with like landscape photography, I feel like you can still capture just about anything that you have in your mind. You know, that you look out there and, you know, the least expected place to get like a pretty good photo or to create something, um, you'd find it there. You just get it like, you know, once in a while, or like, you know, when you're just like on a different state of mind, when you're relaxed or something like that, it just comes to you, and you find a capture, you find a frame that you wouldn't have seen before or something
Mhm.
like that. And it might come in like in the, you know, in different hours of the day or different settings and stuff like that.
Yeah, I
But
think it also, we could argue, you know, we could ask the Baudrillard question and say, what is the value, you know, and is it sort of an exchange value, a use value, an exchange value, or symbolic value?
mm,
And that would be his criticism of Deleuze. By positioning ourselves as essentially desiring machines, as we want to create, all of us, in some sense. And following Pablo Picasso, he also coined the term, you know, we want to create, but we also want to destroy, you know. And the point is, remember, he took a certain image and then destroyed it and invented new ways of painting. Okay, that was his creation through destruction. And I really like that sort of idea, right? But Baudrillard is trying to warn us to say, look, don't be seduced by value. How can we escape the law of value, you know, and do what you just said, which is like create an image because you want to create an image, not because you want to post it on social media and you want to get some likes, not because you want to print it on the wall and admire the moment and future. No, no, no. You know, he would say we're being seduced by these abstract machines would push us to it. So yeah, I think the question of motive is at the heart of philosophy itself, and we would debate this for hours.
yeah. I can see that happening.
Yeah,
But thank you. Thank you anyways.
welcome.
Um, well, I've got two questions, and I know this will take a long time. So, my first question was, uh, from what I had from learning about post-structuralism and the philosophers in the school of thought, someone made a good analogy that they take a sort of anarchism, and not the way of the social type of, you know, communities and those aspects, but anarchism as in deconstruction, as in critique and constant critique, almost to the point of what is the point of the critique? Is there a goal? Or are you critiquing just to kind of deconstruct and analyze? And a lot of times I think that some of your artwork might go with other schools of thought, maybe even theology, when they talk about like sacred geometry. And also when you talk about art and language and being innate, even the central theory of like, we have this idea that there's this one being of, you know, monotheism.
Yeah,
Uh,
pantheism.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. And the other part is when you talk about like the subject object, you know, them being one, it's very similar to Descartes, Spinoza, when they talk about sort of the logical aspects, and we are, you know, the sharing of substance and attributes. And um, there is God, we are God, every existence is part of that. So why did you feel like you're going to, post-structuralism kind of stuck with your philosophy when it comes to photography?
Okay, well, first of all, I mean, Foucault. I kind of fell into Foucault, and my supervisor was a Foucauldian. So you do an apprenticeship with a PhD. You're not really doing it on your own.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone thinks a PhD is something you do. No, it's not. Actually, it's a set of relations amongst a number of people, including the community, the tribe that you're doing it, the school you're doing it, and so forth, right? So I think Foucault, I kind of fell into. That said, what I would like to share is that the sort of the spirit of post-structuralism is incredibly positive and invigorating, because the whole point of deconstruction from their epistemological point of view is to show us that really we can live life quite differently. We can invent new concepts. We can come up with new ways. When I think of problems in Palestine and Israel, you know, it's just the old models or ways of thinking are just not working. And we need a revolution in thinking, not a revolution in war, but a revolution in thinking. And, you know, but I'm glad you brought up Spinoza, because Deleuze is very deeply influenced by Spinoza. He was influenced by Nietzsche, Spinoza, and Bergson. And what he took from Spinoza was the notion of immanence. There is no transcendence for him. It's all in the world. Yeah. That's it. And you know, it's okay. Spinoza equated that to God, but Deleuze does not. But that sort of oneness, that monotheist sort of idea, is actually very much part of the Deleuzian post-structural ontology. He is the only post-structural philosopher that I know that actually created things rather than deconstructed things. And therefore, I joke with my friend the other day. He's also, you know, we talk a lot about this stuff, and I titled the meeting "Life After Foucault," because after you study post-structuralist, you do end up in a bit of an abyss. Yeah. Exactly as you've kind of said. Some will go back to pantheism as a sort of route to try and find an answer to this. Some will go to Eastern philosophies and so forth. But luckily I found Deleuze. And Deleuze for me is, despite Baudrillard's criticisms of him, I'm very inspired. And I think his notion of, you know, the virtual and the actual, how the virtual actualizes into the world is just incredible. I think he's going to be a big philosopher in this, you know, century to come.
That's I mean, I feel like I had that same, what does it all mean after existentialism and you know, talking Nietzsche and then reading Dostoevsky. And so having somebody that kind of helps anchor is super helpful. But bring it to more worldly topics or more sort of personal ones. You've worked with the Abu Dhabi Environmental Agency for a good number of years. How has that influenced your sort of need to showcase nature in its simplicity? What is it? Because again, like you said, with post-structuralism, they're saying, you know, who is influencing you, but what is influencing you to kind of advocate and showcase nature sort of in a way that it is protecting it, you know, is talking about conservation and the need to protect these landscapes and showcase them?
Yeah, I think I'd like to introduce the sort of notion of the we and remove the I. You know, for Barthes, it was culture that sits behind people. And when an author writes a text, which is the same as a photographer who takes a photo, or a painter who paints a picture, Barthes' point of view is that really what is revealed in that image is not the intention of the I, it's not the intention of the author. what it is showing is his perspective that came from a whole enculturation into sort of his cultural time, you know. Deleuze has a sort of similar view, which he talks about as sort of assemblages and rhizomatic kind of connections. You know, if you looked at YouTube, for example, YouTube was not possible until some other things were possible. And what needed to be possible? You needed to have the internet. You needed to have better video recorders. You need to have the TV. You need to have a whole bunch of these things. Now, YouTube was created, was actualized out of the virtuality of all of these possibilities. There's no way of saying the TV created YouTube. No, it did not happen that way, right? So for me as a photographer, the fact that I've worked in the Environment Agency is undoubtedly an influence about connection to nature. But it's also other things. I sort of mentioned that, you know, I'd love to do street photography. I've got a bit of a social documentary kind of gene in me, I would say, where I want to get down and dirty and into the sort of, you know, dark spaces of society and start capturing it, because I think it's important, right? But here, you know, in this part of the world, you just can't do that. It's just too provocative and too dangerous, right? So you can't do it. So again, I've been almost pushed to the landscape rather than pushed to nature, because actually I might have some sort of desire. I mean, but at the same time, I was brought up in New Zealand. I would look out the backyard and look up at snow-covered mountains over the Tararua Ranges when I was growing up. So nature is not something, you know, it's been with me for a long time, right? So yeah, I would say that it's a really complex set of connections, and not the I, you know, and the Environment Agency is one of those little connections that has shaped me or pushed me in a certain direction. Yeah. I think a lot of photographers and artists, there's a certain mystification and a need to create these really convoluted mystical narrative, post hoc narratives around their bodies of work. I'm a little bit suspicious of that, you know, so yeah. But of course, talking philosophy is mysticizing, is esoteric also, but yeah.
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 Cool. So we're at 9:35. I could speak all night. So, but I don't want to, people have jobs. So I want to make sure that they have, if there's anything they want to talk about, that they do so. I was about to say Shabab. Ladies and gentlemen, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to unmute your mic or put in the chat. If not, I might just ask one last question. So anyone else have anything?
I think I might have one like after you.
After, okay. I was
if that's okay. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay. All right. After. Well, I was gonna say, so Michael, from the takeaway, so sometimes philosophy is esoteric. It is harder to grasp because people want sort of simplified versions of existence and why. And a lot of your art reflects that. If you were going to have, let's almost say like a bumper sticker slogan about, you know, why the art, why the minimalism, why the you know, what would you have people take away from your work?
I want to pull out a gun and go like this. A bumper sticker.
Yeah. The slogan. People love slogans. I mean, Trump won 4 years on it.
Wow. Wow.
When you think hard about it.
Man. You know, I had to reduce this down to like 45 minutes worth of talking. You now want it reduced down to one bumper sticker. I think I'll pass on that one.
Yeah, you don't want a word, a keyword, you know, we can play charades.
Look, you know, there's two things.
Mm-hmm.
I think photography can play a productive role in the development of our world, you know, and philosophy can too. And sort of when they're together, you know, I was trying to come up with a word because photograph and philosophy, they both sort of start with this PH. And I'd love to see some sort of collapsing of the two into one new word that would sort of say these things are important. But yeah, I think you need photography, but at the same time, we've got to be always very, very suspicious of it. Because, you know, who's ever wielding the photograph is using quite a powerful ideological weapon. I don't know if anyone ever remembered that poor Jordanian boy that landed on the beach, that they took a picture, you know, that someone come up, found him, took a photo of him. I mean, photographs like that just smack you in the face, don't they? And they're never forgotten. But how a photograph is used, from the post-structural point of view, we have to be really, really a little bit cautious and suspicious of it, you know, which is fine. It's a very long bumper sticker.
I'd be wrapping around my car, yeah, like 4 or 5 times.
Okay, yeah, sorry for that.
Yeah, no.
There's a question I wanted to ask. But I'm just not sure how to phrase it or how to like put it in a sentence. It's just so because I know that you work with the environmental agency or whatever. How would you say it?
EAD.
So the thing I want to ask is like what are your you know, yeah, simple as it is, what are your predictions and how it's gonna like, you know, unfold? How do you think do we actually like because, you know, you hear a lot of things like left and right, like, you know, whether things are hopeless or beyond you know, or it's like past the point of like fixing what we've you know, what we've done already. Is there any hope, or not trying to sound pessimistic or anything like that, but like, do you think we actually like, you know, have a chance to like, you know, create a future for mankind here?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I think there's a lot of hope, you know. You know, there's a lot of hope. I mean, perhaps that's all we've got. You know, and that's why philosophy is so important, because we need to sort of construct new concepts and new ways of thinking about old problems. And some tipping points, if we want to argue that whether they exist or not, tipping points in the ecosystem, whether it be the biome, biodiversity, climate change, fresh water, you know, all of these different things. Some of them are certainly further along than others. But I do have a sort of fairly intrinsic optimism, not in what man does to each other, to themselves, but in terms of solving some problems. And you know, we've done it before, and we did it with the ozone layer that was around over New Zealand when I was growing up. That was going to be an absolute disaster. And that ozone hole is now, if not fully recuperated, because of a global decision to not use certain types of gases, you know, CFCs. Right. Coronavirus, despite all the bad things that has demonstrated, has also, you know, had some very positive things, and has shown us that we can live in a different way, you know. Climate actually improved aside from plastics because of coronavirus. I mean, I joke that coronavirus was actually nature's way of trying to help man solve his climate problems. Air quality in some cities has never been as good as it has been during the lockdowns, and sort of pushed us to live more flexibly. My worry is, of course, that people will want to go back to the old industrialized way of working and living, and will perhaps have a bit of a sting in the tail because they want to catch up on losses made over the last 12 to 18 months. The only area that's a bit, I would say, a bit difficult, and it's going to take a lot of action, is plastics. And actually plastics pollution has been much worse during the coronavirus time than it was before.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
do you actually think it's actually reversible? Like, you know, with all the microplastics that's already been.
That is unknown, my friend. That one is unknown because, you know, these plastics are not decomposing. And but there are some amazing new technologies coming out, which the plastics are decomposable. I mean, truly,
Okay.
not a marketing spin on plastics decomposing when they don't, but actual really new technology that's coming up. So yeah, I'm full of hope. I mean,
Right.
yeah, that's all we got, man.
That's yeah, I see your optimism. That's really great. Just one last thing, like, you know, I just want to point out, thinking that like perhaps this have, you know, the whole climate act that's going on. Do you think maybe this has like sort of like inspired you into your work, like your photography?
No.
Could this have been, or
No.
has this not like led you to a direction?
No. In
Okay.
fact, I wrote my first book on landscape photography and climate change. And when I look at it, it was quite a disingenuous effort. And one of the reasons why I want to correct it and do something that I feel passionate about.
Okay.
You know, it's not that I don't want to solve all of these environmental problems. I do. But there's some sort of curious feature about ourselves of being human that we're attracted to some problems and not others.
Okay. And do you think perhaps that you've been attracted to this environment problem?
Philosophy is a passion of mine for a long time. Photography is a passion of mine for a long time. It's stood the test of time. Working for the Environment Agency perhaps has provoked some sort of concerns, existential concerns and so forth. But no, when I look at the book now, I'm not proud of it. And I'm not proud of it because it was superficial, you know, and it's not good enough. It's not authentic enough, which sounds very existential. I don't want to start another debate. But, yeah.
You're going down that path, I guess. You can see it coming.
Yeah.
I don't think, yeah, it's a good point that you made there, honestly. Like, you can never really like catch yourself out of it. Perhaps there's always some little bits in what you do or what you create that makes you think that it's, you know, it's not authentic enough or whatever, or, you know,
yeah,
like anything.
I think we know sometimes when we're being a bit of an imposter.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah.
And I think if you ask me to talk for an hour and a half on you know, climate change, I would suffer personally. You know, that would be a great difficult you know, to do it. But to talk for philosophy for 5 hours over a shisha and, you know, a cup of Turkish coffee, I could do that every day of the week.
Yeah, so it's more
thank
fun.
You all so much for allowing me to join and to give you a talk. I hope it was enjoyable.
Of course.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining. Right before you go, can you just tell us when you expect your book to be out, and how people might be able to obtain it?
Okay, I mean, that would be wonderful. I mean, my first book is sitting under my desk here. It's a you know, just holding up the desk. That, you know, it's not going anywhere. But the second one, I think, I hope within the next 12 months. You know, I'm just in the middle right now, and I've been sharing some of my ideas and some of the structure in it. So the fact that you've given me a reasonably positive response means perhaps I should, you know, it's like you've given it the like on Instagram, and I now need to continue forward.
I'm glad we could do
you got caught into the algorithm.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Okay, guys. So thank you so much, and I'm immensely grateful, and yeah, hopefully see you on one of your hikes, and I'll bring my camera and my drone sometime. That would be really enjoyable.
Inshallah, there's a lot to see out there. So I appreciate it, Michael. And hopefully we'll see you guys soon, if not on our next Zoom series. We have a few other people, including someone who brings dogs out to the wadis and some drone pilots as well. So we'll be doing that sometime in July. Hopefully we'll see you guys sometime next season on one of our hikes. So excellent. And thank you guys. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Nice to meet you.
All right. See you.
Bye-bye.